Hello again, my beautiful lovies. Today we are going to read Make Way for the Ducklings. It's a big book, so work with me, family. Here's the little ducklings. Make way for ducklings. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods and turtles in the waters, and she was not going to raise her family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. See them flying? When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mrs. Mallard. So down they flapped. See the little island? Surrounded by water. The next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond. But they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. Oh, so polite. The big bird was too proud to answer. But the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the mallards followed them all around the pond and got another round of breakfast. Better than the first. See him in the water, eating the breakfast. "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over, and when—" Oops, I went too far, friends. There's an extra page. "I like this place," Mrs. Mallard said as they climbed out on the bank and they waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But, "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." when she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies. With all this horrid things rushing about, we'll have to look somewhere else." So they flew over Beacon Hill and around the State House. But there was no place there. They looked on Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. They flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts, "that looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings." So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest, and only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew back in. But of course, they could swim. And one day, they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because, look at all those eggs, she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off of the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch or to count the eggs and make sure they were all there. One day the ducklings hatched. First came Jack, and then Cack, and then Lack, and then Mack, and then Knack, and then Quack, Oack, and Pack and Quack. Mrs. and Mr. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided that he would like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder, and he take good care of the ducklings, and don't worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught, and Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns on their speeding cars. Quack, went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, and Pack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. And the cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the Ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quackling back. They made such a noise. Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. Quack, 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 honk, honk, honk. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. That's how you make a way for the ducklings. Thank you, Police Officer Michael. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and he said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street, Clancy." "Family of what? Ducks?" said Clancy. "Ducks!" yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick!" Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned onto Charles Street, with Jack, Quack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" The man who swept the street said, "Well, now ain't that nice?" When he and Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. And when they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was a police car with 4 policemen, and that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The police held the traffic so that Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could go marching across the street, right into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman, and the policeman smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much, they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. When night falls, they swim to their island and go to sleep. The end. I hope you love that story of the little ducklings and their own little island just as much as I do, friends. So, until next time, I love you, my lovies.